anybody else. I invite anybody else to share this live. Everybody else.
Like, share, comment. And listen. And watch.
There we go. Now we're about to go live on Instagram. Dual platforms. That's right. Dual platforms. Real heavy on dual platforms. No time.
You want
Oh, okay. There we go.
you want some drink?
Yes. More. More.
More.
More. More.
You got a pineapple and
Both. Okay. We're live on Facebook. We're live on Instagram. Dual platforms. Today we're reading Until We Reckon by Danielle. How do you say it? Danielle Serene? Danielle Serene. By Danielle Serene. Got some breakfast dropped off. Delicious. It was delicious. Okay, we're gonna get back up. We're still on chapter 1. Until We Reckon, across the river of fire. Hold on. Let me adjust this camera real quick. Okay. I don't know if that's better or worse. We're gonna go with it though. We're gonna go with it. Until We Reckon by Danielle Serene. Page 36. Oh, let me get this headphones on. My fault. Alright, how I sound? I sound good? Okay. We're going to start talking about Annie. We're talking about Annie right now. In the 1990s, I had the fortune to learn from a mentor who helped me see more clearly through this myth than I had before. Annie was an elderly I knew and loved, living in Eastport, Atlanta, and she was brutally robbed and assaulted one night by a young man roughly the same age of her teenage son. Everything in the criminal justice system response went as well as it could have. The police came and treated her with respect. The person who hurt her was identified and arrested. The assistant district attorney showed Annie care and compassion and worked hard on the case. The case went to trial, one of the few that would not be resolved by plea bargain that year in that county. And the jury convicted the person who assaulted her of the most serious charge against him. The judge sentenced him to the maximum allowable prison sentence, a long one by any measure. The system worked as seamlessly as it possibly could. Several years later, when I came to know Annie well, one day I asked, "Miss Annie, with all my respect, may I ask, when that man who assaulted you was sentenced to that long prison term, were you relieved?" And she answered, "Oh yes, honey, of course I was." Let me wait for this pass. And she answered, "Oh yes, honey, of course I was." And I asked, "Can I ask how long that relief lasted?" And she said, "Oh baby, at least 3 or 4 hours. And then I took the bus home," she said, "and I was still afraid. And I got to my apartment, and I was still poor. And I crawled into bed that night, and I still couldn't sleep. And when exhaustion finally took me and I fell asleep, I still had those same nightmares. And when I woke up that next morning, the only difference was that I could not shake the image of that boy's mother's face in court when those guards took her baby away for good. Because that is my face. For all my formative experience that taught me otherwise, I still held on to a desire to believe that prison, at least sometimes, provided victims what they deserve. I did that partly because the thought of it failing to do so was crushingly hard to bear, because of what it had meant for both survivors and those incarcerated. But I also continued to search for proof of that outcome because I too had been so deeply socialized to believe it was there to be found. To be clear, I am not saying that no victims want incarceration. They do. Nor am I saying that the incarceration of someone who causes harm never contributes to a victim's sense of safety or justice. It undoubtedly can. But it accomplishes those things far less frequently than we are led to believe. And even when it does, it invariably falls short of contributing to healing in the way that victims deserve. Years ago, I began to pay attention to a particular phrase that I kept hearing in news reporting about crime: sigh of relief. It was an odd phrase to hear so often, because it does not seem to meet the journalistic standards for precision. It is hard to distinguish between different types of sighs. So it seems unlikely that reporters could consistently identify a sigh of relief when they heard it. But still, it was everywhere. The victim breathed a sigh of relief tonight, knowing that the person who robbed her had been apprehended. Or the shaken victim breathed a sigh of relief, knowing she will sleep soundly tonight, now that the burglar who invaded her home and held her hostage is finally in police custody. The truth is, that's not how trauma works. The night after your home has been invaded and you have been held hostage in your home. The night after your home has been invaded and you have been held hostage is not a night you are likely to sleep. No matter who is in police custody, the apprehension of the person who harmed you can surely help. But in itself will not deliver you peace. In all likelihood, you will be up for days, and when you finally collapse from sheer exhaustion, you are likely to experience night terrors, which will carry into the day in the form of flashbacks in which you relive the experience as though it is currently happening again. Even though the person who did it is in custody. Trauma is profound. It is a persistent creature that burrows its way into our minds and bodies and shifts and evades us when we try to rid ourselves of it. It is possible, though not easy, to heal through trauma. But for all the long-standing and emerging treatments that show great promise, an arrest is not one of them. The story we tell about the role arrests play in healing is a dangerous one for survivors. First, I think of the victim from the news story the next morning. After she has been up all night, after she slept for just 30 minutes at dawn, and was awakened by a nightmare so intense it took her 10 minutes to stop shaking. When she hears that report, it suggests that the arrest should have been enough, and therefore that something is wrong with her, that she is not like other victims whose symptoms stop when that person is caught, that she is different, broken, weak. Given how common it is for victims to blame themselves for what happened, and for the symptoms they experience as a result, perpetuating a narrative that fortifies this belief is not only inaccurate, it is also harmful. But it is not only harmful to the victims who experiences, but it's not only harmful to the victims whose experiences make the nightly news. The same story is one that many of us internalize. If I do come to believe the story, then when I am harmed, I want the person arrested and sentenced because I believe it will bring me relief, as I have been told has done for so many others. We hear few other examples in our public discourse about what will bring such relief, other than perhaps retaliatory violence. Nothing really about healing. Nothing about taking sanctuary in the people I love, in therapy, in faith, in physical exercise, and meditation. And rarely about restorative justice or accountability other than prison. So, I seek the one thing I have been told might ease my pain, because my pain is enormous. My pain is unbearable, and I call the police, and I participate in the process. And if I am like most victims, at the end of doing so, I am still unhealed. I still feel unsafe, and my appetite for justice is still unsatisfied. But now, unlike before, I sought that remedy. I am heartbroken because the thing in which I invested my hope, my time, my energy, and my sense of a possibility other than unending pain has failed, and I am not better. And I think something is wrong with me, because what I was told worked for others did not work for me. And I have been offered nothing else. And for a while, at least, the only thing left to me are rage and despair. We hear a common narrative when news outlets, police, prosecutors, and other elected officials talk about an arrest or prison sentence. They suggest that the consequence imposed on the person responsible for harm is adequate to meet the needs of the person harmed, that the survivor is safe now, relieved, resolved, even healed. This narrative is familiar, but is not based in fact. There is no evidence whatsoever, for instance, that connects the length of a defendant's sentence to the well-being of a crime, to the well-being of a victim of crime. None. The evidence... Excuse me. I can't see the count. Ah, damn. Hold on. Okay, she said, yo. Alright, yo. What's up? No. Okay, it's my fault. I can't see the count. The sun's in that phone real heavy. My fault. Okay. Damn. Where was I? I lost completely where I was. Okay, no, I didn't. Okay, this is where we are. The evidence there is includes the following. Victims want to be heard. They want to provide statements in court, and are often more satisfied when given the opportunity to do so. They want to provide input in sentencing, and are often more satisfied when they feel their input is heeded. They want they want the option to participate or not participate to the degree they choose. They want information about the status of the case, the timing of its resolution, the sentencing outcome, and whereabouts the person who hurt them, including when they are going to be released from incarceration. Some victims report greater satisfaction at longer sentences, but that satisfaction has never been demonstrated to have any correlation with improvements in mental health, reductions in reduction in trauma symptoms, or overall well-being. Nor is there evidence that their satisfaction remains greater over time. And of course, these studies represent a small and typically non-representative sample of victims. Okay. But none of what we know about what victims prefer amounts to evidence that the long sentences we seek in victims' names increase their well-being or alleviate their trauma in any way. One of the places we see this most clearly, though it is never held up as evidence of this point, is in victims' letters to parole boards. It is important to acknowledge that these letters represent only a small subset of victims' views. Most parole boards operate in secret, meaning that there is no way to know how many victims provide letters to parole boards, or what they say or request when the opportunity is given. We do know that victims who want to oppose parole are more likely to participate in the parole process than those who favor it or are neutral. Many believe this is in part because of the more positive relationship these victims have maintained with the prosecution or correctional system, as compared with victims who are not opposed to parole. So we have less information from those letters about the experience and thinking of victims who do not oppose parole. That said, these letters reflect trends that are telling, and the most basic one is this: time after time, victims tell the parole board that they still feel exactly the way they did And the most basic one is this: time after time, victims tell the parole board that they still feel exactly the way they did the day the crime occurred. 10, 15, 20 years later, they feel the same. We also hear this in victim testimonials beyond the context of parole. Their stories of ongoing, ceaseless pain implicate us all. How heartless do we have to be to fail to develop other ways to support healing in the face of the unwavering evidence that what we are doing for victims is not working? If someone's pain does not subsidize over time, it means the tools we are using to transform it are at worst wrong and at best inadequate. If prison worked, survivors would feel better as a result of the incarceration of the person who hurt them. And yet, so many survivors do not. Their pain continues unabated because they are relying on an intervention, incarceration, that is not equipped and was never even designed to help them heal. And yet, when they testify at parole boards that even 10 years of a defendant's incarceration has made no dent in their pain, many people assume the problem is simply that the person has not been incarcerated long enough, as though one day, after 15 years, 30, we will reach the juncture where incarceration will finally help the victim, despite no indication that it has contributed to their well-being thus far. Imagine someone suffering terrible, debilitating migraines. He goes to the doctor and reports his unbearable pain, and the doctor prescribes a medication. He returns the next year and tells the doctor that his pain has not diminished at all. The doctor says to just keep taking the same medication. A full decade later, still racked with pain, he goes back, and the doctor tells him to stay on the medication a little longer. There is no way we would regard that as good medicine or ethical care, and there is no way it is what a person in pain deserves. When we hear victims attest to the unremitting intensity of their pain, we should not hear it as a straightforward justification of more incarceration. We should hear it, at least in part, of an indictment of our reliance on incarceration to help them heal. But despite a profound lack of knowledge demonstrating incarceration benefits victims' But despite a profound lack of evidence demonstrating incarceration benefits victims' well-being, and despite evidence to the contrary, we continually lengthen sentences and victims' names. Elected officials do so through legislation. Judges and prosecutors do so throughout the sentences they've imposed, and parole boards do so in their denial of applications for parole. We're talking about people being denied for possibility of parole. Free Sundata. Those you don't know, he was Asada Shakur. She was alleged to have murdered a state trooper, and he was her co-defendant, and he is still in prison. He's been in prison since this entire time, I believe. His next possibility, he was denied in 2012. I think that his next possibility of parole is not for another decade. I think he's 94. I think he's 94 years. He's either 94 years old now, or he'll be 94 in 2032. Okay. I'm sorry. Let's see, where were we? Okay. I think I'm on lid losers. Okay. We'll start right here. Okay, here we are. As a culture, we repeatedly tell victims that these longer sentences will bring them relief. And we do this without evidence or any basis in the psychological literature to suggest that it would be true. Trauma is not resolved by the infliction of pain on another person. How much simpler things would be if it were true. Our society's continual retelling of this story is quite simply unethical. As a culture, we are selling survivors something that we claim will deliver them from pain, even though we have no legitimate basis to believe it will. We are talking to people who have survived serious violence. In their moments of most profound suffering, and knowingly or not, we are lying to them over and over again. That is not what a society that cares about survivors does. Compounding that fact that prison is almost always inadequate in securing victims' healing, in part because that is just not what its function, is the reality that prisons all too often fail to deliver on its most explicit purpose, providing safety to crime victims. Chapter 2 discusses the limitations of incarceration as a public safety strategy in far more detail. But it is important to note here that the problem with our reliance on incarceration is not just about failing to meet survivors' emotional needs. It is also about failing to meet those. It is also about failing to meet their most basic need to be safe. How we doing? Looks good. Across the country, maybe I'll turn this one a little bit. Hold on. Give me 1 second. Oh no, that's gonna mess up this one. Oh, sorry. Oh, I know what I can do. That looks better. I think that looks better. Okay. Again, reading Until We Reckon, Chapter 1, Across the River of Fire. Across the River of Fire. Across the country, people are working to develop responses to harm that meet survivors' needs. It is in the presence of these options that survivors' wish become far clearer. For instance, at Common Justice, the vast majority of victims who have been given the choice of seeing the person who harmed them incarcerated, or seeing them take part in an alternate restorative justice process, have chosen the alternate process. This made me think about Holes and Stanley Yelnats. What was he charged? He was charged with stealing shoes. Got sentenced to the boot camp. All these survivors are people who participated in the criminal justice system. They are among the less than half of victims who called the police are part of the even smaller subgroup who continued their engagement throughout the grand jury process. They are people who initially chose the path that could lead to prison. They are people who have suffered serious violence, knives to their bodies, guns to their head, lacerations to their livers, punctured lungs, and have engaged the criminal justice system in a way likely to result in the incarceration of the person who hurt them. Even among these victims, when another option is offered, 90% choose something other than that very incarceration they were initially pursuing. 90% is a stunning number in context of the story we have been told about what victims want, and the reality it points to may not be as obvious as it appears. Some certainly choose an alternative process for the reasons we think of first: compassion, forgiveness, the belief that people can change, an experience having caused harm themselves or having loved ones. Let me start this over. I apologize. Some certainly choose an alternative process for the reasons we think of first: compassion, forgiveness, the belief that people can change. An experience having caused harm themselves or having loved someone who did. A desire to be part of transformation. But most are simply more practical. Most choose it because they believe something other than incarceration stands a better chance of meeting their short and long-term needs. What the hell is this? Meaning their short and long-term needs for safety and justice, and for ensuring that others won't experience the same suffering the same suffering that they did. As a country, we have failed to provide victims of violence with real options other than incarceration, to hold the person who harmed them accountable. The decisions of survivors given other options points to an essential way of anticipating survivors' needs. What survivors chose. Yeah, I did. Damn. Damn. What survivors chose when they have only one option does not predict what they will want when they have multiple options that are present. Absent other options, when we ask victims, "Do you want incarceration?" we are essentially asking, "Do you want something or nothing?" And we know that when any of us are hurt, we need something. But if instead of asking, "Do you want something or nothing?" we ask, "Do you want this intervention or that prison?" Many victims want the intervention, and the least we can do is offer them that option. It is essential to note that the overwhelming support among victims for a restorative justice process is not just about the promise of these processes. It is specifically and more broadly about the failure of incarceration to meet victims' needs, including their need for safety. As one victim of a violent crime said to me, "Two things in these robbery cases are always true. One is the people who did it, come back. The other is that their friends don't want to go with." Tell me, what am I supposed to do with that? The victim's questions is a fair one, and one our criminal justice system has abdicated responsibility for answering. If we are going to rise to the challenge of reducing violence, we will have to pay attention to the impact that incarceration has on victims. Listen to the full range of people who survive harm, and become honest as a nation about the profound limitations of prisons as the method of delivering safety and healing. When we do that, we will understand that accountability to survivors requires that we break our dependence on incarceration to address the pain they endure. Choosing alternatives to prison in no way requires survivors to be forgiving or to be invested in the well-being of the person who hurt them. Early in common justice, a case was referred to us in which a boy, just 14 years old, was badly beaten and robbed. The young man who did it was facing 3 years in prison. I went to speak with the survivor's mother to see where she and her son had wanted the young man. The young man who did it was facing 3 years in prison. I went to speak with the survivor's mother to see whether she and her son wanted the young man who committed the crime to be given the opportunity to participate in common justice. She said to me, "When I first found out about this, I wanted that young man to drown to death. And then I want him to burn to death. And then I realized, as a mother, that I don't want either of those things. I want him to drown in a river of fire. But 3 years from now, when my 9-year-old son is 12, he is going to be coming to and from his aunt's house, to and from school, to and from the corner store alone. And one day, he's going to walk by that young man. And I have to ask myself, when that day comes, do I want that young man to have been upstate, or do I want him to have been with y'all? And the truth is, well, if that young man were before me today, and I had my machete, I would chop him to bits, bury him under the house, and sleep soundly for the first night since he dared hurt my child. The truth is, I'd rather him be with y'all. Oh, hey. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Oh, damn. Oh, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Dual platforms. Facebook and Instagram. I said dual platforms. We're live, Facebook and Instagram. I listened back to the sound on Instagram. It didn't sound as good as that with the microphone, but it didn't sound too bad at all. This mother did something I have seen countless survivors do over and over again. She put aside an individual desire for revenge and the interest of what would secure the safety of her child and children like him. During a conversation a few months later with another survivor, also faced with a choice between incarceration and common justice for the person who robbed him, he began drawing a series of boxes on the piece of paper I had in front of him. Then he began drawing X's through some of the boxes. I asked him what he was doing. He said, "The boxes are everyone I know who has returned home from prison. The X's are everyone who went back." What did you say your success rate was? I told him that fewer than 10% of people in the program had been terminated for new crimes. By 2018, that figure was only 6%. And he nodded and said, "Let's do it." Another man who had been robbed at gunpoint asked me, Can he get life without parole for this?" I told him the statute in New York did not allow for that. And he said, "Well then, let's do common justice." So his first preference was that the man die in prison. His second was that he get access to an alternative to incarceration in which he would serve no prison time. And his third, and by far least favorite, was that the person serve any amount of time other than a life sentence. As he put it, if he can't be gone forever, then I'd rather he be changed. For some, that may seem incoherent. Wouldn't a long sentence be better than nothing? But for someone who has seen the limitations of incarceration and producing safety, and who is considering his own safety and the safety of others as his primary decision-making criteria, it makes perfect sense. If not forever, then none at all. These survivors' decisions align with national findings. In 2016, the Alliance for Safety and Justice conducted the first national poll of crime survivors that explored their preferences regarding criminal justice policy. The poll found overwhelming support, even higher than among the general public, for The poll found over. See that young man? He got beat up by the police. They're trying to bring awareness to situations like this in Rockford. So we're just reading books right now. Stop by anytime. We're gonna be here all April. Thank you. Let me go fix that sign. I'll be back. Real nice. Beautiful day today. Beautiful day. Day 7, book 7. Until we reckon. Danielle should read. Let's just start this paragraph over. These survivors' decision aligned with national findings. In 2016, the Alliance for Safety and Justice conducted the first national poll of crime survivors that explores their preferences regarding criminal justice policy. The poll found overwhelming support, even higher than among the general public, for rehabilitative programming, alternatives to incarceration, and shorter sentences, as well as greater investments in education, mental health treatment, job programs, and drug treatment. Roughly 52% of crimes roughly 52% of crime victims answered that they believe that time in prison makes people more likely to commit another crime rather than less likely. Perhaps for that reason, 69% of victims preferred holding people accountable through options beyond prison, such as rehabilitation, mental health treatment, substance use treatment, community supervision, mostly probation and parole, or community service. The findings are not surprising to people who work closely with crime. Crime survivors, but they are directly contrary to the public and law enforcement narrative about what the victims want. Even in the context of what could be fairly described as a 4-decade media and public education campaign promoting incarceration, the portion of victims who see it as an effective remedy is far smaller than public discourse reflects. When it comes to punishment, survivors consistently express a desire for options other than incarceration, and an interest in them when they are available. Yet, the criminal justice system rarely offers alternatives to prisons as response to violence. According to the Downstate Coalition of Crime Victims in New York, survivors/victims want the people who harm them to be held meaningfully accountable. Many survivors and victims find the criminal justice system, including incarceration, to be inadequate and or counterproductive to that end. What this means in practice is that when the country relies almost exclusively on incarceration to address serious crime, many survivors lose out. Survivors' preferences about criminal justice policy are only one part of the larger set of needs and desires, including real hunger for solutions that have nothing to do with punishing the person who hurt them. These priorities include safety, housing, trauma-informed care, fair treatment, prevention, and having a real voice in potential solutions. Opening these avenues of support is therefore as essential to developing survivor-centered responses as any reform of the criminal justice system will ever be. Imagine there's a hamburger stand in the middle of the desert that sells really bad burgers. There is nothing for 200 miles in any direction. You pull up to it, and you see an extremely long line. If you can... Oh, what up, what up? How you doing? No. Oh, yep. Damn, that is. You're right. Damn, how you feeling?
Good, man.
We live right now. We live on camera right now.
All right.
Yeah. How you do? Let me go. Imagine there is a hamburger stand in the middle of a desert that sells really bad burgers. There is nothing but 200 miles in any direction. You pull up to it and you pull up to it and see an extremely long line.
Oh, somebody brought you Popeye?
Somebody brings us Popeyes every day.
Every day,
Every day for like a month. Yeah, I don't touch it.
If you conclude, based on that line, that you had just come across the most delicious burger in America, you would be missing something. Let me read that again. Imagine there is a hamburger stand in the middle of the desert that sells really bad burgers. There is nothing for 200 miles in any direction. You pull up to it and you see an extremely long line. If you concluded, based on that line, that you had just come across the most delicious burgers in America, you would be missing something. Okay. In this country, we have offered survivors nothing. We wait for this to go by. In this country, we have offered survivors nothing but that. In this country, we have offered survivors nothing but that bad hamburger stand in the middle of nowhere. We have offered only two choices: something or nothing. Bad burgers are nothing for miles. And when some survivors have chosen something, we have used it to promote the hamburger stand. We have claimed they loved what we gave them and that they wanted more. We have done that, never having asked them why they chose it, never having asked them how they felt, and never having asked them what they would have liked instead. It is not hard to understand why so many people are in that line for burgers. We have all done it. When we have been hungry enough, whether because of need or circumstance, we have eaten food that we know will not nourish us. Food we do not want or like. Food that would make us feel sick later. Food we have sworn we will not eat anymore. Food we will never choose again if there were other options, because we are too hungry to eat nothing at all. The fact that we ate it should not be used as evidence that it was good food. I believe we owe it to victims to offer more than better than... Let's start this over. I believe we owe it to victims to offer them something better than a nasty burger. I believe that if there was a chicken spot and a veggie spot and a pizza spot and a taco spot alongside the burger stand, the line for burgers would be dramatically shorter and more people will be well fed. I believe that what people chose when they have only one option is no predictor of what will be chosen, of what they will choose when they have others. There is another thing you would see standing in that long line at the hamburger stand. If you looked off to your left, you would see a long line of people driving. You would see a long line of people driving by. People who knew. Excuse me. You would see a long line of people driving by. People who knew there was nothing else for 200 miles. People who were as dizzy with hunger as you were. People whose mouths were watering, but who could not bear the thought of eating that food because they knew how bad it would be for them, and that in the end it would be worse than nothing. Those people are the majority of victims who do not even call the police in the first place. And we owe them exactly as much as we owe the people in line for those awful burgers. The former Brooklyn District Attorney Charles Hines used to tell a story about a bumper sticker his colleague, another DA, had. It said, "Victims say, catch and release for fish, not felons." The first few times I heard the story, my only reaction was to be horrified by the dehumanizing comparison it drew, and by the levity with which it did so. But after a while, something else struck me about the story. The line, victims say. Here was a top-ranking law enforcement official in his jurisdiction, and his bumper sticker said, "I say catch and release for fish, not felons." It said, "Victims say." And the more I thought about the bumper sticker, the more I realized it revealed something about the criminal justice policy in the United States. That regardless of whether our policy is motivated by a concern for victims, whether it produces the outcome they seek and deserve, and whether their input is gathered to inform our practices, we still do what we do in their names. Their experience, their pain, as well is the well from which decision makers draw their moral authority.
Oh, she just left. All right. Tell her Anthony Jenkins came out. Jenkins? Yeah. All right, y'all take it easy.
Their experience, their pain is the well from which decision make. Oh, okay. I have become persuaded that if we made a record of what victims really say, if we listen deeply and well and ask open-ended questions, we would end up with a criminal justice system that would look surprisingly like the one we developed if we listened to what defendants say. It will be characterized by accountability, by safety, by justice, and by healing. And it will look very little like what we have today. This is not mostly about mercy. When survivors advocate for shorter prison sentences, parole, or the reallocation of funding from the criminal justice system to the social service infrastructure that prevent and heals violence, they are often presumed to be forgiving. It is assumed that their policy preferences are motivated by mercy and grace. For some, they surely are, but for most, they are displaying what I would argue is one of the most common and vastly underestimated qualities of the crime survivors. Survivors are pragmatic. Saying survivors are pragmatic does not mean that they are not emotional. It means that their emotionality does not prevent them from making highly rational decisions, even in the face of their pain and fear and rage. Survivor safety, well-being, and sometimes even survival depend on the efficiency of response to violence. In jails and prisons are largely an ineffective response. Incarcerating the person responsible for harm is inadequate, even in the limited number of cases in which it produces some concrete benefit. And it is often devastating to survivors when its impact is directly contrary to the aims of safety. Let's start this over. And it is often devastating to survivors when its impact is directly contrary to the aims of safety, healing, and justice that their lives depend on. Survivors know this better than anyone. They have paid the price for prison's failure with their pain. Survivors therefore need something from those of us committed. Survivors therefore need something from those of us committed to them. If it is true that survivors are a far wider-ranging group of people than we know, if it is true that incarceration does not consistently deliver safety and almost never delivers healing, if it is true that basic things like validation, control, and a coherent narrative are necessary elements for overcoming trauma, if it is true that survivors who are given options almost always choose anything other than prison, if it is true that millions of survivors tell us again and again, every time they do not call the police, that what the criminal justice system has to offer does not work for them, then it does seem to follow that survivors absolutely, urgently need all of us to end mass incarceration. And may be the only practical thing we can do in their name. Is good? Did you come to read? You're listening? Yeah.
It's easier to hear if I listen live online.
Really?
I used to sit here
Yeah.
because of all the cars.
Are the cars or something? We got the speaker, but there's nobody's here. We didn't employ it. Do you want to read?
I gotta leave in about 20 minutes.
About 20 minutes? It's up to you. It's up to you if you want to.
Let me see if I got some reading glasses.
Okay.
I won't be able to.
Okay. No, it's all right. It's all right. You don't by no means do you have to. By no means do you have to. I just didn't know if that was something that you had wanted to do.
Oh, okay, well, I can. That's fine.
Okay.
I just thought I'd come down and listen. And
Okay.
show some
All right,
support.
y'all.
All right.
Smooth. I'm
Y'all
gonna
be
wait for
smooth,
it
y'all.
down here.
All right, you be easy. All right, we'll see you. Okay.
We started there at
Yeah.
chapter 2.
Yep, starting at chapter 2, prison's broken promise.
And then what are these so I can hear?
Yeah, these
or-
are so you'll be able to hear yourself. Just to make
Okay.
sure the sound is good.
I don't know if I like the sound of my own voice though. It's weird.
Yeah, it
Oh,
does, dude. It's
okay.
a little bit noise can't smooth his back so it don't fall off.
All right.
Do you want a water or anything?
Sorry?
You want a water or anything?
No, I'm good. Thanks. Chapter 2, Prison's Broken Promise. America has long had a love affair with punishment. With a few critical exceptions, at virtually every decision point in the criminal justice system, we choose the more punitive option over any available alternative. As a publication by the John Jay College of Criminal Justice describes it, this has become manifest in all aspects of the criminal justice system. At the front end, through more aggressive policing practices, in the court system with fewer diversion programs or alternatives to prosecution, during the period of confinement as the nation's jails and prisons have become more crowded and the experience of incarceration more punitive, and at the back end of the system where the conditions of supervision have become more oriented towards surveillance and monitoring and less oriented towards supportive service and reintegration. We mete out long, harsh prison sentences that contribute to a rate of incarceration that is historically unprecedented and internationally unique. We suspend children from school beginning as early as preschool. We arrest people for low-level offenses that other countries regard, and we in the United States have previously regarded, as either nuisances or prompts for help and support. We punish addiction and incapacitate mental illness. We control each other, punish each other, and throw each other away. In the criminology field, this tendency even has its own term. People call it American penal exceptionalism. Some of the clearest and most devastating examples of this punitiveness in recent history lie in mandatory minimum sentencing laws, which specify a minimum prison term to which a judge must sentence someone found guilty of a certain offense. These laws functionally remove judges' discretion to act with mercy, to factor in complex circumstances or causes, to take into account a victim's view when the person doesn't favor a lengthy term of imprisonment, or to consider the impact on public safety, both the degree to which incarceration is necessary to secure it and the point at which it might become counterproductive, in the decisions they make. The particular case or the humanity of the people involved are misplaced and outdated assumptions about what helps victims heal and be safe, our disregard for the context of a crime as a relevant factor in determining an inappropriate consequence, our failure to understand prison as a tool with limitations that should be treated as such, and our assumption that all people who cause certain harm are fundamentally the same as one another and essentially monstrous. We remove our ability not only to empathize, but to think, to act rationally, and to make decisions that prioritize healing, safety, and justice. As a nation, we have chosen to constrain ourselves as a way of assuring that any options other than extreme punishment, mercy, reason, practicality, fairness, will not overwhelm us in the face of an opportunity to punish. In so doing, we not only lose our ability to apply fair, strategic, proportionate consequences, we also insulate ourselves from responsibility for the decisions we are making because, from a legal perspective, we have taken all other decisions off the table. Former U.S. District Judge Nancy Gertner observed that over a 17-year judicial career, I sent hundreds of defendants to jail, and about 80% of them received a sentence that was disproportionate, unfair, and discriminatory. In part because of the way in which these decisions run contrary to our nation's core pronounced commitment to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we also see political and communication strategies that both normalize and Americanize a level of punishment citizens of other countries would find unimaginable. Perhaps the most obvious of these are the variety of three strikes laws that mandate courts to impose harsher sentences, often mandatory sentences of 25 years or to life, on people who commit a third felony crime. In some states, these enhancements apply at just the second strike. Just over half of states have three strikes laws, and though most require that at least one of the three felony crimes that trigger the consequences of violent crime in many states, the other two can be nonviolent felonies. In a particularly egregious but all too common example, a man named Curtis Wilkerson, who had participated in a robbery when he was a teenager, stole a pair of socks nearly 15 years later. The theft constituted as a third strike, and he was sentenced to a life term in prison for the crime. Although it is a common and relatively long-standing practice in the United States to impose longer sentences for people who were previously convicted of crimes, it was not until the 1990s that this became mandatory, stifling judges' ability to use their discretion when they thought it was appropriate to set a less extreme sentence. While Washington State's Initiative 593 in 1993 was arguably the first three strikes legislation, it was Proposition 184 in California the following year that would take the three strikes and you're out message to the voters and would be credited broadly for starting the trend that resulted in 26 states and the federal government having three strikes laws on the books just a decade later. These laws were part of a wave of policy shifts that contributed to the rise of mass incarceration nationwide, and they have come under fire in recent years as not only draconian but ineffective. The 2012 Proposition 36 in California, for instance, went a distance to limiting the reach of the three strikes law there, though it did not eliminate it. If initial harsh sentencing in one extreme of punishment, another is the elimination of the possibility of parole and other forms of early release. When people are paroled, they are released after completing the required sentence a judge imposed, but before completing the allowable maximum penalty above and beyond that requirement. Parole is designed to recognize, reward, and motivate good behavior in prison, and it acknowledges the fact that people's consequential thinking, remorse, maturity, and risk to public safety change over time, and reflects a belief that sentences should reflect those changes. As mass incarceration has increased in this country, we have seen more people going into prisons, but have also seen far fewer coming out, as the portion of those who are eligible for parole and released declines, mirroring the increase in sentences. From truth in sentencing laws, which require people to serve a certain portion of their sentence regardless of good behavior or rehabilitation, to the functional elimination of parole in states that rarely grant it. The decision to keep people in prison, no matter what happens while they are there, enforces a disbelief in the human capacity for change and even transformation. Enshrining this belief system in law didn't come easily. It took work to normalize these laws and policies and make them feel American, particularly in a nation where so many people hold religious beliefs rooted in doctrines of redemption. This normalizing and Americanizing of punishment didn't begin or end in the 1990s, and it was almost always interwoven with another American narrative, the long story of race and racism. Although punishment is by no means an exclusively white on black phenomenon, white people punish one another, people of color punish one another, white people punish people of color who aren't black, and much less frequently, people of color punish white people. Its evolution in the United States is inextricably intertwined with the history of slavery and its aftermath. The history of slavery exemplifies the mutually reinforcing link between racialized dehumanization and extreme punishment. Whole generations of people do not give up their freedom willingly, and the level of violence required to keep slavery in place was extraordinary. Black people were subjected to horrific acts of violence, and their race was used as a justification not only for their enslavement, but for the violence that kept them enslaved. The racialization and all its attendant myths regarding the biological and moral inferiority of black people was necessary for white slave owners to become people who could commit that level of harm against other human beings. It is hard for anyone to inflict extreme pain on people we see as fully human and whose experience we see as reflective of our own. Our capacity for empathy is powerful, and when it is present, it interferes with our ability to hurt others. The act of empathizing is one of linkage. We draw on our own experience to imagine the experience of another person. So to imagine how extreme punishment would feel, lashings, beatings, burnings, and more, we would have to imagine how it would feel to survive it ourselves. But if we can persuade ourselves that there is something about the person we seek to punish that is fundamentally different from us, less than us, or become more capable of disabling our empathy, of telling ourselves that the pain they feel will not be like ours because they are not like us. In that way, racism is a profound enabler of cruelty by white people, because it provides a way to bypass the otherwise natural and often overpowering capacity for empathy. In doing so, it augments white people's capacity to engage in punishment that exceeds what a person would otherwise regard as appropriate or allowable within shared human community. Countless white people have told ourselves for centuries, beginning at an extreme, all-consuming level in the context of forced labor and punishment, that black people do not feel pain the way we do. The legacy of this thinking is tenacious. Even when white people begin to see the unquestionable reality of black people's humanity, the notion of black people's imperviousness to pain can persist and can shape white people's responses to black people as victims and as people responsible for harm. When black people are victims, white people too easily ignore their pain. And if white people are using pain in an instrumental way as punishment, it is easy to infer that black people will need to feel more pain for it to register at the same level as if it would for their white counterparts. If we had to concretize that difference, one might argue perhaps even at a 100-to-1 ratio would be reflective of white people's ethos, that is, of the disparate in sentencing for powder versus crack cocaine were used as a guide. Arguably, the most pervasive justifier of dominance and control, white supremacy, and here I do not just mean the KKK and its equivalents, but the far broader, more prevalent, and often less overt set of views and behaviors that state or imply the superiority of white people and justify their use of power to maintain inequity, is the ultimate normalizer of violence. To persist, the violence that white dominance depends on has to become so ingrained in the culture that it is regarded not as immoral aberration, but as part of the natural order of things. White supremacy had to make the enslavement and torture of human beings normal. It has to make police violence against people of color normal. It has to make sexual violence against women and trans people of color normal. It has to make putting people in cages and beating them as rehabilitation normal. The Harvard historian Khalil Gibran Muhammad describes these kinds of normalizing efforts as the condemnation of blackness. This normalization allows for the continued violence against people of color and secures white people's impunity for this kind of harm. After all, we punish people for breaking our culture's norms, not for upholding them. As punishers, white people can further protect ourselves from the pain or empathy our empathy would cause us and free ourselves from the constraints it would place on our behavior if we add to dehumanization another familiar American ingredient, paternalism. If we go a step beyond telling ourselves that the person we are punishing will not feel pain in the same way we would, and also tell ourselves that the pain we inflict will make them better in some way, teach them a lesson, then we may even feel ethical as we do harm that would otherwise be unthinkable. As slavery ended, white people substituted punishment for the other forms of control they had exerted when they had legally reduced human beings to property. As historian Douglas Blackman documented so powerfully in his book Slavery by Another Name, the same people who had just been enslaved were often arrested for petty crimes and made to work, often in the same fields from which they had just been set free, as part of the nation's convict leasing program. This practice was insulated from constitutional challenge because the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery retained a caveat that has continued to shape our culture to this day. It says that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. This was not the last time America would substitute explicit race-based control with control based on one's status as a convicted criminal. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow traces this history with unrelenting clarity, meticulously drawing a damning continuity between slavery, convict leasing, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration. Like Jim Crow and slavery, Alexander argues, mass incarceration operates as a tightly networked system of laws, policies, customs, and institutions that operate collectively to ensure the subordinate status of a group defined largely by race. Or as she puts it more explicitly, today's lynching is a felony charge. Today's lynching is incarceration. Today's lynch mobs are professionals. They have a badge, they have a law degree. A felony is a modern way of saying, I'm going to hang you up and burn you. Once you get the F, you're on fire. Once you get that F, you're on fire. People of color are not immune from acting as agents in the expansion of incarceration. That said, their participation in its expansion in no way disproves the fact that systems have structural racism at their core, nor does it indicate that black people's relationship to the punishment of their communities is the same as white people's. As legal scholar James Foreman Jr. traces in his book, Locking Up Our Own, black people are constituents and elected officials, and as practitioners in the criminal justice system, have long been a part of the rise of mass incarceration. For some, this was rooted in a particular demand for morality and a belief that a small portion of the community was compromising the integrity of the rest and should be separated from it for the well-being of the whole. For others, it arose out of desperate need to secure the safety of their families and loved ones in a context in which structural factors made violence nearly inevitable and punishment seemed the only near-term solution available. And for some, it stemmed from, only somewhat ironically, a distrust of white people, of their permissiveness about drugs that were poisoning a generation of young black people, and of their restrictiveness about guns, which black people had not been allowed to own for generations because white people feared the power they could wield collectively if they were armed. None of these responses require dehumanizing black people, but to the contrary, were often rooted in a deep regard for their fellow black people's humanity. But all of the responses involved grappling with the impact that structural racism was having on black communities and the inaccessibility of more transformative solutions, such as policy shifts that would bring about improved economic stability, education, or health care. Alongside the country's exceptional punitiveness runs a concurrent trend of extreme impunity. A society can abide this level of punishment only if some people are promised protection from it. We see that protection throughout our culture. Wealthy people are far less likely to be imprisoned for crimes, whether violent offenses or white-collar crimes. Men are highly unlikely to be convicted of and sentenced to incarceration for crimes like rape and domestic violence. White people are far less likely than their black counterparts to be arrested, charged, convicted, sentenced, or given the maximum sentence for any crimes, including drug, property, and violent offenses. And strikingly, although black people who kill white people account for a disproportionate number of those sentenced to death, virtually no one receives this ultimate sanction for killing a black person. Educating white people about these disparities will not be enough to end them. In fact, evidence shows that the opposite may be true. The disparities are not just a product of policy, they drive it. A heart-wrenching Stanford University study found that when white people were asked about the appropriate level of punishment for a crime, they showed some moderation in their responses. When a matched group of white people was first told about racial disparities, that group supported a higher level of punishment than their counterparts who had not been given that information. That means that when white people understood that the law had a disproportionately negative impact on people of color, they became more supportive of that law, not less. That reflects two interconnected realities. Deep-seated anti-black racism continues to thrive among white people, whether conscious or not, and white people expect insulation from punishment and overall are not afraid of draconian laws we think will not ever be applied to us or our white loved ones.
You You still reading or you finished?
No, I get it. I got an appointment I got to get to. So, but that was cool. I had to get that one for myself.
How to feel? Feel awkward or?
No, it's just with all the background noise.
Yeah, I was listening.
So, any requests for what you guys want to eat later? Lasagna? Okay. All right. Okay.
Oh, with meat though.
With me? Okay. All right. I do have some salmon at home. I'm vegetarian.
Oh damn.
I don't know if this is one of my.
I think that looks good. Yeah. 1 second, it has to set up. No, that looks worse. That looks worse. Okay, we're gonna go with that. We're gonna go with it. Yeah, this don't look too bad. This don't look too bad. Okay. I'm not sure. No. Hold on. Did she show?
Huh?
Did she show you where she left off at?
No, she didn't. I think it's. Yeah, it was over here.
Can you see her? Okay. We see. Okay. For page 59, reading until we reckon. We see that protection throughout our culture. Wealthy people are far less likely to be imprisoned for crimes, whether violent offenses or white-collar crimes. Men are highly unlikely to be convicted of and sentenced to incarceration for crimes like rape and domestic violence. White people are far less likely than their black counterparts to be arrested, charged, convicted, sentenced, or given the maximum sentence for any crimes, including drug, property, and violent offenses. And strikingly, although black people who kill white people account for a disproportionate number of those sentenced to death, virtually no one receives this ultimate sanction for killing a black person. Educating. Let me move this around. Okay. Educating white people about these disparities will not be enough to end them. In fact, evidence shows that the opposite may be true. The disparities are not just a product of policy; they drive it. A heart-wrenching Stanford University study found that when white people were asked about the appropriate level of their punishment for a crime, they showed some moderation in their responses. When a matched group of white people was first told about racial disparities, that group supported a higher level of punishment than their counterparts, who had not been given that information. That means when white people understood that the law had a disproportionately negative impact on people of color, they became more supportive of that law, not less. I would think that this ties back into what we were saying before, or what we were talking about earlier, that maybe is that a youth thing? Maybe that's a youth thing? The no sound? I don't know. I listened to it back and the sound was good. Let me see. Messing around with the Instagram a little bit. Hold on. Okay. Here we go. This does really tie back into what we were talking about yesterday a little bit. How some of these actions that got put into place, they were purposeful. This wasn't a case of, oh, we just made a little mistake, or this wasn't a case of, we did something on accident, or we just happened to make. Hello, how you doing? Good. Or we just happened to make this decision, or these were purposeful decisions. These were not perfect. These were purposeful actions. These were purposeful things that were done. These were actions that were made with malice and made with intent, made with pre-thought out meditation and things like that. This wasn't a case. These aren't cases of, oh, we just chose the wrong thing. These policies, these systems, these statutes and things like that, they were designed and made to be oppressive. They were designed and made to hold people down. They were designed to to disproportionately harm and affect black people and people of color. These were designed to be oppressive. These were designed to contain people and hold people down. All these statutes, all these laws made, all these crimes made, these weren't accidents. These weren't accidents. This was done with malice. This was done with malice in their eyes, malice in their hearts. Okay. Let's get back on track. Let's get back on track. That reflects two interconnected realities. One, deep-seated anti-black racism continues to thrive among white people, whether conscious or not. And two, white people expect insultation from punishment, and overall are not afraid of draconian laws we think will never be applied to us or our white loved ones. This truck passed by. The problem is that punishment and impunity are both incompatible with the response to crime that can transform behavior and heal harm: accountability. The following chapter will explore why accountability works so well, but first it will be useful to explore why punishment does not. Some of America's attachment to prison comes from overestimating the efficiency of punishment, the efficacy, I'm going to have trouble with that one. The efficacy of punishment as an agent of change. Social psychologists have long noted the ways in which punishment is limited as a method to affect behavior positively. Research shows limited returns from punishment overall, and diminishing returns on both the individual and societal level as penalties are used more frequently. Similarly, research has shown that many people experience other types of sanctions imposed against them as comparable to or even more difficult than incarceration. Punishment is often presumed, particularly in public discourse, to be effective, with little rigor applied to that presumption. Whether intellectual rigor or a careful examination of the results that punishment produces, an exemption to that trend, a 2014 National Academy of Sciences report on report on the causes and consequences of incarceration maintains that any punishment that is more severe than is any punishment that is more sorry. That's something in my eye. Let's get this out of my eye. Any punishment that is more severe than is required to achieve valid and applicable purposes is morally unjustifiable. The moral integrity of our criminal justice policy depends on our accurately understanding the roles punishment can and cannot effectively serve. There is a vast theoretical literature about punishment, written by scholars trying to make some sense of what we do as a people. Most of these theories converge around four key purposes of punishment: deterrence, rehabilitation, incapacitation, and retribution. It is useful to explore each purpose as it relates to the reduction of violence, and to scrutinize why punishment has not delivered safety to the degree that much of this foundational theory suggests it could and should. Deterrence. Individual deterrence is the belief that punishment will keep someone who has committed a crime from doing so again, or that the threat of punishment will prevent someone from committing a crime in the first place. General deterrence suggests that punishing one person for a given crime will deter others from committing the same crime, and possibly even other crimes. As a theory, deterrence is compelling enough, but in reality, it is crushed by a combination of pervasive arbitrariness, a lack of civic education, extreme racial disparities, and profound despair in the communities most impacted by crime. Deterrence theory assumes the existence of a set of circumstances that do not exist. To begin with, it assumes a level of civic knowledge and awareness that everybody knows what the consequences are for a given crime. Increasing the length of sentences does not work to motivate change if no one knows that these sentences have changed. As a culture, we simply do not possess that level of knowledge or awareness, nor do people typically learn about their peers and neighbors' sentences with enough context to anticipate the consequences of their own actions. In a program I directed more than a decade ago, I asked the young people I worked with, all of whom had been incarcerated, what penalty they thought might accompany the crime. What penalty they thought might accompany the crime they were committing at the time they committed it. Some of them, about a third, admitted honestly that they gave no thought whatsoever to the penalty. Others, roughly another third, said they thought the penalty would be substantially less than it turned out to be. But people in the third segment of the group said they had anticipated a far greater penalty than what was in fact allowable, but were indifferent to that consequence at the time. Because one might argue that incarcerated young people are precisely the group for whom deterrence did not work, and that maybe everyone else got the message. I asked a group of high school students in a poetry class I was teaching what they thought the penalties were for a range of common crimes. The answers were all over the place. Extremely low, extremely high, and almost none of them accurate. Some of this is because of the lack of civic education in our society, and some of it is because the sanctions are applied so arbitrarily or in such a biased manner. Many people get a slap on the wrist for the same crimes that result in enormous consequences for others. That drawing any correlation between actions and consequences is almost impossible. The problem with arbitrariness, and bias is that deterrence theory also assumes a consistency of sanctions. Deterrence works only if the same action typically results in the same consequence. And the reality of the U.S. justice system cannot be further from that. Sanctions are inconsistently applied by different decision makers, and often even by the same one, shaped irrefutably by race and class and perceptions about both, and distorted to a degree that would make it difficult for people to predict a likely response to their own behavior. But perhaps more crucially, deterrence also assumes and arguably even requires that people have hope. It assumes that you have reasons to believe that if you do not engage in certain negative actions, you will not suffer the same consequences as people who do. That means not only that you will not go to jail if you do not break the law, but that means you will be able to get a good education, get a job, raise your family, live in peace, and not be hurt. One of the most undeveloped dimensions of deterrence, and a significant part of why it fails so profoundly in this country, is that people are not guaranteed the benefits of full, healthy participation in our society when they abide by the law. The United States does not deliver on the promise of the social contract. People do not get the benefits of doing their part, and absent that, the whole deal falls apart. Punishment, and deterrence in particular, is rooted in an assumption that people lack an adequate level of fear, and that if they were more afraid, in this case, of the consequences of their actions, they would behave differently. The trouble is, anyone who has lived and loved people in the communities where violence is most present knows that fear is everywhere. Fear is omnipresent. It is overwhelming. Fear of violence, fear of prison, fear of loss. It is based not just on the anticipation that something bad might happen, but in the lived experience of that very thing happening over and over again, of surviving loss, of surviving incarceration, of watching loved ones terribly hurt, of losing loved ones to the grave, of losing them to prison. What appears as an adolescent hubris is often in fact its opposite, a heightened sense of vulnerability. Research has shown that many adolescents anticipate and even overestimate their imminent mortality. They believe their deaths are inevitable, and the feeling that manifests as risky behavior is often not seen Okay, hold on. They believe deaths are inevitable, and the feelings that manifest as risky behavior is often not a sense of invincibility, but rather a sense of despair. In neighborhoods where people hear gunshots throughout the night and walk around chalk outlines and police caution tape in the morning. Virtually the only people who are not afraid are those that have felt so much fear that they have crossed through it into numbness. And in neighborhoods where, statistically speaking, 1 in 3 boys born today are likely to be incarcerated in their lifetime, the only young men who do not fear prison are young men who have accepted in its The only young men who do not fear prison are young men who have accepted its inavailability, or have exceeded their maximum capacity for fear, so much as to have become inured by it. The problem is that numbness is not indifference, nor is it a feeling of omnipotence. Numbness, like despair, is what experts call a trauma response to an unmanageable excess of fear and terror. For the purposes of deterrence, the trouble with trauma responses is that you cannot scare them away. To the contrary, increasing fear only further entrenches with such responses and the harm that arises from them. Research bears this out. Studies show a limited and disputed link between the length of sentences and the increased deterrent effect on either the individual or community level. What then of the research suggesting that deterrence has a positive effect? It is increasingly clear that while overwhelming evidence demonstrates that the severity of a sanction does not affect behavior, the swiftness and certainty of it might. This means that we do not get to safety through excessive punishment, but rather through consistency. These findings have been used to justify a great deal of interventions focused on certainty and swiftness, with decidedly mixed outcomes, but have not always been put toward what is arguably their most profound use. Allowing us as a culture to detach from severe sentences with evidence-based confidence that such detachment will not diminish our safety, that notion is borne out in the data, including recent studies that show the vast reduction of incarceration in California and New York has not contributed in any measurable way to a rise in crime. The upshot is that a community where people who commit harm are consistently apprehended and meaningful consequences are consistently and quickly imposed does not need those responses to be severe, brutal, or lengthy. In fact, the opposite stands true. As we know that lasting impacts of incarceration on communities include great damage to the very social fabric that holds community well-being in place. What is required then is not to ignore the wrongdoing or impose greater and greater sentences, but rather to foster meaningful responses to harm that can displace the current pattern of arbitrariness and the toxic mixture of extreme punitiveness and impervious impunity. Okay. You wanted to read?
Sure.
You want to read? Okay, I'm gonna pass it off to a new reader.
What's that?
I was just talking into the camera. I was talking to the camera. We're on page 64 of Until We Reckon by Danielle Sarid. Rehabilitation. We're gonna start right there. Rehabilitation.
Okay.
All right.
All right, man. What do I got to do?
Do I need headphones or anything? And just start reading.
This is just to hear yourself.
Oh.
Just make sure the sound is not too bad or nothing.
Yeah. Hope this chair will hold me. I'm not a little guy. Is this live?
This is live, right?
Oh, shit.
I should have said something beforehand. Right there, rehabilitation.
How close do I need to be to the mic here?
Decently close.
This good?
I think we'll be able to pick you up from there.
All right.
Maybe scoot in just one little bit. The chair. I was talking about the chair.
I'm getting close to the edge here.
Okay, I think that's perfect.
All right.
Let me check this out. Make sure this is working. Okay. No, we're
All right.
You're good. You're good. Whenever you're ready.
All right, so I'm reading from Until We Reckon, written by Danielle Sered. Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair. Beginning on page 64, Rehabilitation. The brutalities of prison have been widely documented, from the psychological torture of solitary confinement to the prevalence of sexual and other violence. Prisons suffer from overcrowding, are poorly equipped to handle the significant portion of incarcerated people who have mental illness, and have sustained massive cuts to the very programming, such as substance use treatment and college education, shown to reduce violence in prison and recidivism after release. It would be hard to conceive of a less rehabilitative environment than a U.S. prison. People often talk about someone being sent to prison to teach them a lesson. It seems that rehabilitation would consist largely of learning that lesson, but we are never particularly clear about what that lesson is meant to be, nor how it is taught or whether it is ever learned. In theory, the lesson would be whatever the incarcerated person needs to learn to ensure that he or she would not commit further crime. But of course, multiple learnings contribute to that transformation. To live a life without crime or violence or both, one needs to understand the impact of one's actions on others, take responsibility for those actions, and make things as right as possible. People need to develop the skill set to make good decisions, both to exercise sound, consequential thinking and develop the capacity to control their impulses and wrangle their anger safely and productively. They need to connect their actions to the consequences that follow. And to do so, people need a context in which responses are clear, swift, proportionate, consistent, and fair. People need to be able to make ends meet legally, so they need the skills to get and retain a job that can generate a living wage. They need to heal through old wounds that drive cycles of violence, to uproot the pain, heal what can be healed, and develop strategies to cope with what remains. They need to disrupt any unhealthy relationships to alcohol and other drugs, and to learn strategies to address the underlying drivers of any harmful use. Wow! And they need to build healthy, strong, interdependent relationships that can protect the durability of these lessons in the face of change, loss, and other stressors. These things are hard to do in any context. Prisons make the work of rehabilitation strikingly difficult, though to the great credit of so many people who are incarcerated, never totally impossible. Large portions of incarcerated people live in conditions where there are far more people in each housing unit than intended, as is the case in prisons across the United States. This overcrowding, at its worst, contributes to substantial and pervasive violence, but even at its best, results in constant, piercing clamor, chaos, and sleeplessness. This is not a place conducive to reflection. What's more, prison does not merely fail to rehabilitate the people it confines, it contributes to the likelihood that they will commit greater harm in the future. Recent research has established prison's criminogenic impact, meaning that it is a driver of crime and violence. As scholars Cullen, Johnson, and Nagin summarize, prisons are no likelier than non-custodial sanctions to reduce recidivism. And what's worse, The use of custodial sanctions may have the unanticipated consequence of making society less safe. Many studies that claim to demonstrate that prison has some efficacy do so by comparing incarceration to nothing at all, rather than comparing it to other strategies or interventions. This distorts the reality of what happens in practice.
Real quick.
Yeah.
When you're done, whether we feel like we've read enough for today, whenever that is.
Yeah, man.
As much as you want. I just go tell her.
Sure.
Good. Okay.
All good. So many studies that claim to demonstrate that prison has some efficacy do so by comparing incarceration to nothing at all, rather than comparing it to other strategies or interventions. This distorts the reality of what happens in practice and conceals the harmful effects of prison that become particularly clear when prisons are appropriately and realistically compared with sanctions like community-based interventions that serve as alternatives to incarceration, treatment programs, and probation, the other likeliest responses to cases that move through the criminal justice system. Cullen et al. Described the criminogenic impact of incarceration as follows. For a lengthy period of time, they, incarcerated people, associate with other offenders, endure the pains of imprisonment, risk physical victimization, are cut off from family and pro-social contacts on the outside, and face stigmatization as cons. Imprisonment is thus not simply a cost to be weighed in future offending, but more important, a social influence that shapes inmates' attitudes toward crime and violence, peer networks, ties to the conventional order, and identity. They conclude accordingly that most criminologists would predict that, on balance, offenders become more, rather than less, criminally oriented due to their prison experience. This is consistent with the findings of a wide variety of related research. In examining the effect of labeling people, in this case with terms such as convicts and felons, on their future behavior, one study of 95,919 people found that those who received a formal label were more likely to recidivate than those who did not. A 1993 study found that prison had strong direct criminogenic effects, and a more recent 2002 study showed no evidence that incarceration reduced recidivism, and in fact found that it was associated with an increase in recidivism, particularly when compared with other sanctions like probation. A number of rigorous and highly regarded meta-analyses, which integrated the findings of a range of studies to discern an overall trend or conclusion, have found that incarceration is associated with increases in recidivism ranging from 7% to 14%. When we understand what drives violence, the fact that prison contributes to it should not surprise us. Decades of research about the individual level causes of violence, as opposed to community conditions like poverty and disenfranchisement, has demonstrated 4 key drivers: shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and a diminished ability to meet one's economic needs. At the same time, prison is characterized by 4 key features: shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and a diminished ability to meet one's economic needs. As a nation, we have developed a response to violence that is characterized by precisely what we know to be the main drivers of violence. We should not be surprised, then, when the system produces exactly the results that we would expect. It is worthwhile to look at these 4 drivers in more depth. First, shame. Shame is widely regarded as a producer of violence. Chapter 3 explores this connection in greater depth, but it is essential here to lift up Dr. James Gilligan's influential work developed over decades of practice, which identifies shame as the central driver of people's choices to commit violence. Gilligan distills the desire to commit violence as an attempt to quell arising feelings of shame, which include weakness, inadequacy, worthlessness, and failure, by eradicating or punishing the person perceived as the source of that feeling, and displacing shame with a feeling of pride through the exercise of power and control. This may mean a man beats his girlfriend who has borne witness to his limitations. It may mean that someone who is ashamed of having been unable to protect his loved ones from harm in turn causes harm to someone else, even someone other than the person who hurt his family. It may mean that someone who was disrespected in front of his peers visibly reasserts his power through violence. Shame is a tremendously uncomfortable feeling, and few people can abide it for long without seeking a pathway out. When the most available way out appears to be violence, people often choose it just to quiet the intolerable sense of shame that otherwise agitates and haunts them. Dr. John Rich has talked about this dynamic in the context of street violence and distills the code of the street to being largely a matter of demonstrating and securing respect and managing disrespect. This respect is not just about ego. Rather, respect is widely understood as a safeguard against injury and death, as it is only people who are respected who can expect to be protected from otherwise inevitable and widespread violence. Together with Gilligan's analysis, this means experiences that diminish, degrade, or emasculate people, particularly when that happens visibly and publicly, are a recipe for violence. Imagine then, and will continue to suffer as a result. Add to that the way in which prison is defined in part by an utter lack of privacy and a total exposure over which people have no power. People are showering in front of others, using the bathroom in front of others, dressing and undressing in front of others, being sick when they are sick and broken, when they are grieving and visible in every moment and emotion and physical condition they endure. They add the reality of violence, sexual violence, physical assault, and the constant threat of both. Add the ways in which people are visibly forced into conceding a seat in the dining hall, a turn in the gym, an item obtained from a commissary, a place in line, a shower, a meal, a bed. Add to that the ways that corrections officers frequently diminish the humanity of incarcerated people, not just in the form of violence, but in behavior that is secured by the threat of violence and the enormous power differential. Times when correctional officers call incarcerated people names and dare them to respond, push them, insult their families, tear their Bibles and step on their prayer rugs, throw their food away in front of them, subject them to searches of their cells and their bodies, force them to strip, make fun of their bodies, make fun of their conditions, make fun of their lack of freedom, taunt them, threaten them, toy with them, and deny them basic dignities. Add all the time when people are beaten in plain sight, witnessed as they lie prone, bleeding, unconscious, racked with pain, and when their scars, as well as the process of healing through their injuries, are fully visible to everyone around them. Remember, too, that most of these people are survivors of violence, abuse, of harm done to them as children, and so the shame of that unhealed pain underlies every instance of degradation and fear. Together, even when an individual does not directly experience serious violence, and those cases are rare, these factors are a powder keg of shame that not only characterizes the period of a person's incarceration, but also accompanies them home, even as they secure their physical freedom. Second, isolation. Strong, durable connections to others, particularly those who have our short and long-term interests at heart, reduce the likelihood that we will commit violence. This makes sense. So much of violence relates to unprocessed pain and loss, and relationships that can witness and help transform those experiences can help people identify outlets other than violence for responding to their hurt. For the parts of violence that relate to a feeling of vulnerability and exposure, For the parts of violence that relate to a feeling of vulnerability and exposure and associated powerlessness, supportive relationships can help people feel connected and protected in a way that softens the need to assert their power unilaterally. When violence is about poverty and an inability to meet one's basic needs, having people who will make introductions to potential employers, offer temporary housing, make loans, share or pool resources, and help strategize about pathways to stability can diminish a person's perceived need to acquire resources through violence. Connection is also associated with a greater sense of self-efficacy, including one's ability to make changes to the circumstances that create limitations or pain. Finally, being witnessed by people we respect can fortify our commitment to our best selves. For many people, one of the strongest protectors against harmful behavior is our estimation of how those we respect will react to our choices. Isolation is the enemy of all these protections. It is an ally of trauma, as silence fortifies traumatic stress and can perpetuate cycles of pain. Similarly, isolation stimulates and exacerbates shame, as our separation from people only serves to reinforce our notions of our unworthiness and our distance from human community. Isolation disengages the anchor we have placed in relationship and sets us to sea unmoored from the love, values, and obligations that otherwise guide and constrain our behavior. Prison is made of isolation. Its fundamental nature is to separate people from their communities. Not only are people physically separated, but phone calls to people on the outside are restricted to particular times and durations and are typically extraordinarily costly, often as much as $13 a call, frequently with additional service and connection fees. Visits are often limited by a wide range of ever-evolving restrictions, and particularly when people are incarcerated in prisons far from where they lived when they were free, can place unsustainable burdens on the loved ones visiting, especially during long sentences. Access to information and news can be limited. Many books and periodicals are banned or unaffordable, and mail is restricted and almost always read by prison officials before being delivered to ensure that the content is allowable. Even when the content is deemed acceptable, the fact that people know their writing will be read by authorities diminishes the honesty and intimacy of what they share. Although people can form strong bonds with others within a prison, the prevalence of violence and abuse fosters an atmosphere of distrust that impedes the formation and durability of intimate friendships. And even when people build close relationships, despite those barriers, friends are often transferred to other units and separated from each other for the duration of their sentences. Prison systematically separates people from those who love them most, who live lives that reflect the best of their shared values, who hold them most accountable, and who would otherwise contribute most to their development, healing, and responsibility and rehabilitation. I'm going to pause for this truck to go by. Isolation also happens in the extreme within prisons. Many prisons assert their power and control through the use of solitary confinement. Sometimes solitary confinement is used as a punishment for serious and violent infractions. Often it is used for far lesser offenses. And it is too often used as retaliation for reporting harm or raising concerns, for expressing unpopular views or worshiping the wrong God, and for organizing among incarcerated people. Whatever the impetus for someone's relocation to a single cell, often no more than 6 by 9 feet, with no window to the outside world, the experience of solitary confinement stretches the bounds of what human beings can survive with their sanity intact. The United Nations has classified periods of solitary confinement longer than 14 days as torture. Countless studies have demonstrated the short and long-term debilitating impact of solitary confinement on people's mental health. Consequences that can far outlast the time people spend enduring such intense punitive isolation. As Justice Reformer Johnny Perez, who served 3 years of 13 years incarcerated in solitary confinement in New York State, described it in an interview with the nonprofit group Solitary Watch. There is no interaction whatsoever with other humans. The officer comes in every hour, and even then there's no contact, no talking, no communicating, not even any eye contact in extreme cases. The last meal is at 4:30 in the afternoon, with the next meal being at 6 o'clock in the morning. If you're not standing wide awake by your door, then the officer walks by, you don't get a tray. Solitary confinement affected me in a number of ways at different times. As a youth, because I did some solitary time as a teenager, it affects your self-esteem. It affects your self-confidence and the way that you see yourself. It makes you aggressive. It makes you angry. It makes you impulsive. It makes you an introvert. There were times when I contemplated thoughts of suicide, though I never voiced it out loud. I tended to internalize a lot of the oppression. Sometimes officers tell you, hey, you ain't shit. This is you. This is your life. You're nothing but a criminal. Hearing that once or twice a day is nothing. But hearing that day in and day out for months at a time, you start to say, damn, you know what? Maybe I ain't. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I am what they say I am. As an adult, my behavior was more reactionary toward others. I remember hating all authority figures, no matter who it was. Supervisors, officers, judges, lawyers, just hating the entire world, you know. So a lot of that was more outward, versus when I was a teenager, it was more self-directed. I learned that with solitary, or even prison, but more like solitary, it's a second-by-second attack on your soul, where every second is spent thinking about the next second. And that just makes the day so long. You try to sleep it off, but sometimes too much sleeping drives you to be awake for long periods of time. You don't do solitary time, you survive solitary time. And I know this to be true because some of my peers did not survive solitary time. They've either left psychologically different than when they came in, or committed suicide. It is hard to imagine a practice more contrary or detrimental to the aim of rehabilitation, and hard to imagine someone's affirmatively transforming in such a tortured context. It is as impractical as it is immoral. The third driver of violence is exposure to violence. Research and experience show decisively that there may be no experience more likely to predict committing future violence than surviving it. These cycles and the interplay among individual and structural factors is explored further in Chapter 6. And it is important to note here, in this context, the way in which violence itself normalizes violence. The prevalence of any experience can make that experience increasingly normal to the people who live it. I'm going to repeat that. The prevalence of any experience can make that experience increasingly normal to the people who live it. Rather than widespread violence contributing to an increasing sense of its importance and urgency, it can, especially when unaddressed or unhealed, have the opposite effect. It can render the experience normal. When people are continually exposed to violence, it becomes the rule rather than the exception, as though the world arranges itself around violence rather than being disrupted by it. Exposure to violence also increases the likelihood of someone committing harm by modeling power through violence. When young people in particular see others acquire power, respect, positional authority, material wealth, or status as a result of violence, it suggests a viable pathway to achieving it. Absent other accessible and visible routes to power, those who survive or witness violence may choose violence as the road to their own elevation. Trauma resulting from surviving or witnessing violence only increases the likelihood of these pathways. In addition to rage and numbness and difficulty regulating emotions, the hypervigilance that often results from trauma increases people's sense of danger, even in situations of relative safety, and can broaden the range of situations in which they perceive violence as necessary to securing their safety. Wow. At its most basic, violence creates a context in which people experience a failure of systems or strategies for protection, and so seek out new or enhanced ones to make sure they will not be hurt or be hurt again. When violence itself appears to be such a strategy, people will often deploy it out of real or perceived necessity. And when people cannot secure that protection alone, they will seek connections that help them do so. This may include an individual, a loosely formed peer group, or a more formally organized gang. People who have committed or will join them in committing the violence they believe is necessary to ensure their survival. Exposure to violence requires and animates the rapid development of new safety strategies. And when the healthiest and least harmful strategies are available or have failed, people turn to other ways to secure their respect, belongings, and lives. All too often, and in far too many contexts, violence seems to be the one remaining strategy available for doing so. The rates of violence experienced by incarcerated people are extraordinary. It's estimated that roughly half of incarcerated women experienced serious physical or sexual abuse as children. 86% experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. More than 2/3 experienced intimate partner violence. And nearly all experienced some sort of violence prior to their incarceration. That violence continues in new forms in jails and prison. As author and advocate Donna Hilton, who served 27 years in prison, wrote, "For many women, imprisonment began long before the day they registered in prison. Years, decades, lives of abuse and neglect spurred many women to make one desperate decision that finally, ultimately led them to prison. Too often, by the time a woman commits a crime, her only goal has been survival. The prison system on the inside is the same as law enforcement on the outside, in my eyes and experience. They could do whatever they wanted to you, no matter what you told them and no matter what the truth was. Unless you had a good ally in a powerful position to speak up for you, you were at their mercy and whim. For example, when a woman complains about an officer blackmailing her for sex or raping her, she is promptly thrown into the box for months, even years. What does the inmate, a woman, get punished? Why does the inmate, a woman, get punished for that kind of accusation? It's piling abuse on top of abuse. Forms of sexual abuse aren't about sex or gratification, they're about control and power. Domination of any kind hurts and manipulates the mind more than anything. Predators target the most vulnerable, and incarcerated women who have been subject to violence are the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. In prison, everything is stripped from you, especially your self-pride. The link between domestic abuse and a prison full of wounded, broken, silenced, crying women is undeniable. I realize that the physical, emotional, and mental abuse inflicted on women by men was universal and felt by most women to some degree. No matter her skin color, education level, or location, it was there, woven into the fabric of our lives. The halls of Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, were filled with women, the walking wounded, who asked the eternal question that everyone asked, how and why did I get here, and what reasons do I have to keep going, to keep living? The violence experienced by incarcerated people may be committed by other incarcerated people or by corrections staff. No matter who is responsible, the result is traumatizing to those who survive it and is typically met with impunity. Very few acts of violence in prison result in meaningful responses, in part because reporting violence often exposes incarcerated people to more rather than less risk. Violence is not an exception in prison. It is the daily defining norm. Aside from the physical pain and injury so many people experience, the constancy of violence results in peak levels of hypervigilance, fear, and the pained, interminable alertness that surviving prison requires. Prison violence is not limited to physical assault. The National Prison Rape Elimination Commission The National Prison Rape Elimination Commission, a bipartisan effort by Congress to identify and address the extent of sexual violence in U.S. prisons and explore the adherence to the standards in the 2003 Prison Rape Elimination Act, found shocking rates of rape and other sexual violence in prisons across the country. A 2007 Bureau of Justice Statistics study estimated that 60,500 people incarcerated in state and federal prisons were sexually abused in the prior 12 months alone. Any survivor's experience of sexual violence requires a profound healing process. But first, it requires at least a minimum level of safety. People who are sexually assaulted in prison are typically confined with, or all too often by, the very people who raped them. Bait stressors within families and in other relationships, such as strain or discord resulting from unemployment, barriers to paying child care costs or child support, untenable housing arrangements, and unmanageable debt, and to individual factors that diminish self-esteem, nurture shame, and block pathways to education and gainful employment, such as poor schooling, limited work experience, limited availability of steady employment opportunities, untreated trauma and illness, child care challenges that interfere with employment, and poor health and mental health. Inequity can be acutely painful and may result in resentment and hurt, as it exposes the difference between one's difficult circumstances and the relative ease that others enjoy. Further compounding such circumstances, lack of opportunities suggests the permanence of these conditions, the blockage of any pathways out, and the futility of effort and sacrifice. Too many people who choose violence as a means of meeting their economic needs do not experience it as a choice between genuinely available options. They experience it as the inevitable election of the one option available to them. The context of all-consuming violence described earlier as a core feature of prison is made worse by a toxic combination of economic hardship and few, if any, options for positive engagement and development. The options for work in prison are limited, and even when work is available, the wages are minuscule, typically not more than 12 to 40 cents per hour. These wages go to pay required fines and fees, which in felony cases often amount to thousands of dollars. Even in that context, many incarcerated people continue to try to support their loved ones back home and will send the remaining meager funds they have to their family on the outside. These barriers to economic stability and self-sufficiency continue after people are released. And many leave with obligations to pay outstanding fines and fees. It is widely known that a criminal record can be a barrier to obtaining gainful employment. So the prospects for formerly incarcerated people to earn a living wage are vastly reduced. While Ban the Box and other efforts to prevent employment discrimination on the basis of a criminal record have gained traction in recent years, the barriers persist. And even in the absence of discriminatory practices, the fact that someone has not accumulated work experience for the duration of their sentence is often detrimental to their ability to secure economic stability. This is problematic not only because it extends punishment beyond the end of the sentence, but because employment is demonstrated to help guard against recidivism. One underutilized strategy is demonstrably successful at preventing recidivism: college education in prison, which has been shown to dramatically reduce rates of reoffending and reincarceration. Still, only a minute fraction of prisons offer college education, and then only to a small percentage of the people incarcerated in those facilities. Because people in jail or prison are excluded from receiving federal financial aid available to all other college students, few incarcerated people can afford to participate remotely in higher education while they are imprisoned. Other educational opportunities are also rare. Few prisons have adequate basic education, vocational training, substance use treatment, mental health treatment, or other programs that would support people upon release to leading meaningful, productive, and law-abiding lives. These programs can work when they are available, but despite soaring investments in corrections across the country, and despite the relatively low costs of such programs in comparison to other spending on incarceration, those dollars have not led to an associated rise in the kinds of interventions that might truly contribute to rehabilitation. Most people then have few outlets for personal development that could sustain their well-being while incarcerated and position them for success upon release. The factors that drive violence and fundamentally characterize prison are all mutually reinforcing. Exposure to violence drives isolation. Isolation drives shame. Shame drives poverty. Poverty drives exposure to violence, and so on. Far from being rehabilitative, prison all but guarantees the durability and continuation of cycles of violence, and in many cases increases the likelihood of further harm rather than reducing it. The next section is titled Incapacitation. Incapacitation is perhaps the least disputed of the effects of incarcerating someone. It is the simplest. It just means that for the time people are imprisoned, they are physically incapable of causing further harm to others in society, other than most who are incarcerated with them. There is truth to that, and there are unquestionably people who cannot be in society without hurting others. But even that seemingly straightforward benefit of incarceration turns out to be more complex. Take this situation as an example. Pablo was riding the subway home from school when he looked up and saw a group of young men approach him. He knew immediately it was trouble. Two of them had been harassing him for the past 5 years. Noise break. Okay, so he knew immediately it was trouble. 2 of them had been harassing him for the past 5 years. When he first arrived in the United States, when he was in the 6th grade, one of them said something to him after his first day of school and swung at him. Pablo didn't speak English yet, so he still does not know what the boy said. He fought back, and, probably only because of the adrenaline that fear sent coursing through his body, won. Ever since then, these boys have never left him alone. This time was worse. One of the young men in the group flashed a gun at Pablo. Pablo jumped off the train at the next stop and ran to the police. They apprehended the young man with the gun, but not the others. If they had, these boys technically hadn't done anything wrong. At the time, Pablo wanted to be a police officer after he graduated high school. He hated the violence that plagued his East New York, Brooklyn neighborhood and admired people who stood up to it. He saw the police as those people. When he engaged them for protection after the incident on the train, he expected to be safer. He was not. Pablo made a report and the same week testified before a grand jury, helping the prosecutor secure an indictment of the young man with the gun, whose name Pablo now learned was Alberto. The court issued an order of protection requiring Alberto to stay away from Pablo's home and work. The next day, Pablo came home from work and found his young brother collapsed in the doorway of his apartment building. The boys from the train had come to his house. They had learned the address from the court's protective order, looking for Pablo, but they did not find him. So they beat his brother instead. Pablo felt a great responsibility to ensure the well-being of his family and was terrified and outraged about what had happened. He looked at his brother's injuries. He thought of his mother and young sister upstairs. This time he did not call the police. Pablo did not go out seeking the boys who did this, but he did stop attending school and work to stay home with his family regularly. Later, he would tell staff at Common Justice that he looked into the average police response time to his address and found that it was 1 hour and 8 minutes. He asked what he was supposed to do for 1 hour and 8 minutes if the young men who beat his brother were knocking down his door. He considered getting a weapon for the first time in his life. Not to retaliate, but to be prepared to defend his family if they broke through the door and held that gun to his mother's head. Pablo was unable to graduate from high school on time. His relationship with his girlfriend became strained as he withdrew from everyone but his immediate family, and his employment was tenuous because of all of his absences. He could imagine 1,000 ways the situation could escalate, ways he and others could lose their lives, but he could not see a way forward to safety. When Common Justice reached out to him to tell him he was eligible for services and that if he was interested, Alberto could participate in the program too, he asked a series of pointed, methodical questions and then offered an unequivocal yes. As he said then, "I'm not afraid of Alberto. He's not the problem. The problem is the short, loud one, the one with the braids." Pablo explained that he believed Alberto's incarceration would only exacerbate the tensions he'd had with those 2 young men and a larger group of people they were connected to. Pablo chose Common Justice because he thought it could finally help put the conflict to rest. He was not sure if it would work, but it was the first thing that seemed as if it might. It was not that it made him happy, it was that it made sense. Alberto seized the opportunity to participate. As part of his responsibilities in the program, he was required to do a wide range of things, including engaging in a violence intervention curriculum and attending school regularly. But perhaps most important to Pablo, one agreement required Alberto to communicate to those other young men that Pablo and his family should be protected from any violence, threat, or harm. It was not an agreement the court could require, but as an independent program, Common Justice could reach further into the community to get the underlying causes of conflict. And several weeks later, Alberto brought those men to Common Justice's office and told them in front of staff, "I respect Pablo, and I respect his family, and I expect you to do the same. And if you can't respect them, then I need you to understand that if anyone touches a hair on any of their heads, the DA will come looking for me. And if the DA comes looking for me, I will come looking for you." He leveraged the best and worst parts of the reputation he had built with these peers to protect Pablo and his family. At the time of this writing, More than 8 years after the meeting, Pablo and his family have not been hurt or threatened. What's more, Pablo has gotten his life back. He moved out of his family's home, has advanced in his career, grown personally, and stopped living in the constant, legitimate fear that he or his loved ones would be harmed. And Alberto has honored his commitments, keeping a job, building his own future, and being a different kind of role model for the young men and others like them who followed his lead that day on the train. About a year after the meeting with Alberto, Pablo asked me, seemingly out of nowhere, "How many cops are there in New York?" And I said, "Around 35,000. And then he said, "And how many people work at Common Justice?" I told him the answer at the time, 6. Pablo said, "That's hilarious." I asked why. He said, "Well, because it was y'all who could keep me safe." What is evident in this story is a reality that incapacitation fails to account for. That most violence is not about a single bad individual intent on causing harm. Most violence happens in context and in relationship. The context of alliances and rivalries, of history and conflict, of poverty and competition for resources, of drug markets and underground economies, of neighborhoods and of families. Although sometimes the threat to a person's